Welcome, everyone. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most reliable predictors of economic downturns, the yield curve. It might sound complex, but don't worry, we'll break it down and explore why economists and investors pay such close attention to this powerful indicator. Let's start with the basics. The yield curve is a graph that shows the relationship between interest rates and the time to maturity for a given type of bond, usually U.S. Treasury securities. Typically, it slopes upward, meaning longer-term bonds have higher yields than shorter-term ones. This makes sense, right? You'd expect a higher return for locking up your money for a longer period. But here's where it gets interesting. Sometimes, this curve inverts. That's when short-term rates become higher than long-term rates. And this inversion has been a remarkably accurate predictor of recessions. Let's look at the track record. Since 1960, every recession in the United States has been preceded by an inverted yield curve. That's a pretty impressive batting average. Specifically, when the spread between the 10-year and 3-month Treasury rates becomes negative, it's been a reliable signal that economic trouble is brewing. But why is this the case? To understand that, we need to dive a little deeper into what the yield curve represents. The yield curve isn't just a random squiggle on a graph. It reflects the collective expectations of countless market participants about future economic conditions and monetary policy. When investors anticipate a recession, they expect short-term interest rates to fall in the near future. Why? Because central banks typically cut rates to stimulate a slowing economy. This expectation leads investors to buy more long-term bonds, locking in current rates before they potentially fall. This increased demand for long-term bonds pushes their yields down, potentially below short-term rates, resulting in the inverted yield curve we're talking about. Now, it's important to note that the yield curve inversion doesn't immediately trigger a recession. There's usually a lag. Historically, recessions have followed yield curve inversions within 6 to 24 months. So it's not an immediate alarm, but more of an early warning system. Let's take a journey through history and examine some notable recessions and their corresponding yield curve inversions. The Great Depression of 1929 to 1933 was the most severe economic downturn in modern history. While we don't have reliable yield curve data from that period, it's worth noting as a benchmark for severe recessions. The stock market crash of 1929 triggered a banking panic and a collapse in the money supply. GDP fell by 26.7%, and unemployment reached a staggering 24.9%. Moving forward to the 1960s, we encounter some interesting economic events. The recession of 1960 to 1961, while relatively mild, is notable as one of the first recessions where we have clear yield curve data. The yield curve inverted in late 1959, about a year before the recession began. This downturn saw unemployment rise to 7.1%. Another significant event from the 1960s is the credit crunch of 1966. This is an interesting case because it's often cited as an exception to the yield curve's predictive power. The yield curve briefly inverted in 1966, but a full-blown recession didn't immediately follow. Instead, there was a credit crunch that required intervention from the Federal Reserve. This event is sometimes referred to as a mini-recession or a growth recession, where economic growth slowed but didn't turn negative. The recession of 1969 to 1970 is another example from this decade. The yield curve inverted in late 1968, about a year before the recession began. This downturn was characterized by a combination of rising inflation and unemployment, a precursor to the stagflation of the 1970s. Unemployment peaked at 6.1% during this recession. Fast forward to the 1970s, and we encounter a series of recessions influenced by global oil shocks. The recession of 1973 to 1975 was particularly severe. The yield curve inverted in early 1973, several months before the recession officially began. This period saw stagflation, a combination of high inflation and economic stagnation. Unemployment reached 9%, and GDP declined by 3.2%. The early 1980s brought us a double-dip recession. The first part occurred from January to July 1980, and the second, more severe part lasted from July 1981 to November 1982. The yield curve inverted before both of these recessions. These downturns were largely the result of the Federal Reserve's aggressive monetary policy to combat inflation. Unemployment soared to 10.8%, the highest since the Great Depression. The recession of 1990 to 1991, while relatively mild, is notable for its connection to the savings and loan crisis. The yield curve inverted in 1989, about a year before the recession began. This downturn saw GDP fall by 1.4% and unemployment reach 7.8%. One of the most studied recessions in recent memory is the dot-com bubble burst and subsequent recession of 2001. The yield curve inverted in early 2000, predicting the recession that would begin in March 2001. While this recession was mild in terms of GDP contraction, about 0.3%, it had a significant impact on the technology sector and saw unemployment rise to 6.3%. The Great Recession of 2007 to 2009 is perhaps the most significant economic event since the Great Depression. The yield curve inverted in 2006, about a year before the recession officially began. Triggered by the subprime mortgage crisis and the collapse of the housing bubble, this recession saw GDP fall by 4.3% and unemployment peak at 10%. Most recently, we experienced the COVID-19 recession in 2020. Interestingly, the yield curve had inverted in 2019, several months before the pandemic hit. While the pandemic was the immediate cause of this recession, the prior yield curve inversion suggests that the economy may have been vulnerable even without this external shock. This recession, while sharp, was also the shortest on record, lasting only 2 months due to unprecedented fiscal and monetary interventions. It's crucial to note that while the yield curve is a powerful tool, it's not infallible. As we saw with the 1966 example, not every inversion leads to a full recession. Moreover, recent changes in global economics might affect its predictive power. When analyzing the yield curve, economists often focus on different spreads. The most commonly watched is the spread between 10-year and 3-month Treasury rates. However, some also pay attention to the spread between 10-year and 2-year rates, or even the near-term forward spread, which compares market expectations of short-term rates in the near future with current short-term rates. Among the many yield spreads analyzed, the 10-year minus 3-month yield spread is often considered the most critical by economists. This is because the 3-month rate reacts strongly to Fed policy, making it a precise reflection of current monetary conditions. Also, the 10-year to 3-month spread has shown fewer false positives compared to the 10-year to 2-year spread. For example, in June 1998, the 10-year to 2-year spread inverted, but the 10-year to 3-month did not, and no recession materialized. It's also worth noting that the depth and duration of the inversion can provide additional information. Generally, the longer and deeper the inversion, the more likely a recession becomes. While the yield curve is a valuable tool, it's important to consider it alongside other economic indicators. These might include 1. The stock market performance. 2. Consumer confidence indices. 3. Manufacturing activity. 4. Unemployment rates. 5. Housing market trends. Now, let's focus on a crucial aspect of the yield curve's predictive power that we haven't discussed yet: the timing of the recession's onset. Many experts argue that a recession typically starts not when the yield curve initially inverts, but when it begins to normalize, that is, when the 10-year and 3-month Treasury rate spread moves from negative back to positive. This transition from negative to positive is often seen as a more immediate signal of an impending recession. After the yield curve uninverts, or crosses back above zero, a recession typically follows within a few months to a year. This pattern has been consistently observed in historical data, with recessions often beginning shortly after this transition. However, it's important to note that the exact timing can vary. Recessions may take anywhere from 1 to 6 months to materialize after this signal. This variability underscores the complexity of economic systems and the multitude of factors that can influence the onset of a recession. Let's apply this understanding to our current situation. The yield curve inverted in late 2022 and remained inverted through much of 2023 and into 2024, setting a record for the longest inversion. As of November 2024, we're approximately 18 to 24 months from the initial inversion. Given the duration and depth of this inversion, and based on historical patterns, the probability of a recession occurring within the next few quarters, late 2024 to early 2025, would be considered high by many economists. However, it's crucial to note that as of October 2024, some measures of the yield curve, like the 10-year minus 2-year spread, had just turned positive again. This recent development aligns with the theory we've just discussed that the transition from negative to positive spread could signal the imminent onset of a recession. If this theory holds, we might expect to see signs of economic contraction within the next few months to a year. However, it's important to exercise caution in this interpretation. While this pattern has been historically reliable, it's not infallible. As of late 2024, some strategists were considering the possibility that this latest inversion might have been a false signal of recession. Several factors contribute to this uncertainty. 1. The unprecedented nature of recent economic events, including the global pandemic and subsequent recovery. 2. The aggressive monetary policies implemented by central banks worldwide. 3. Structural changes in the global economy that might affect the yield curve's behavior. Moreover, it's crucial to consider other economic indicators alongside the yield curve. Factors such as employment rates, inflation, consumer spending, and global economic conditions all play significant roles in determining whether and when a recession might occur. In conclusion, while the yield curve's transition from negative to positive is a valuable indicator of potential recession timing, it should be considered as part of a broader economic analysis. As we navigate these uncertain economic times, it's more important than ever to take a comprehensive view of economic indicators and remain adaptable to changing conditions. The key takeaway is this: the yield curve is a valuable tool, but it's just one piece of a complex economic puzzle. It's an early warning system, not a crystal ball. By understanding how it works and what it signifies, we can be better prepared for potential economic shifts. That's all for today. If you found this helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more economic insights. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.